vengeance on the wealthy landowner. A mother's final cry. In this rewritten story, we follow the chilling events that unfold in the home of a wealthy landowner named Mr. Leland. The setting is an eerie and ominous rural estate, where hidden malice simmers beneath the surface of an outwardly successful family. Mr. Leland, although rich and powerful, is haunted by his obsession with having a male heir to carry on his name. His 3 wives, each entangled in a web of rivalry, bitterness, and ambition, become embroiled in a dark plot when Mrs. Leland, the 3rd wife, gives birth to a boy. However, her joy quickly turns to tragedy as a horrific turn of events leads to her untimely death and the newborn's demise. What follows is a descent into pure terror as the lingering spirits of Mrs. Leland and her baby return to seek revenge against the malicious forces responsible for their suffering. These ghostly retribution manifests in the form of eerie apparitions, vengeful whispers, and harrowing nightmares that torment the guilty, as the walls of Leland's once magnificent estate become a battleground for the living, and the dead, madness, fear, and guilt consume the household. No one is safe from the wrath of the spirits, and their revenge comes with terrifying precision, sparing no one involved in the plot. The story climaxes in a gruesome and horrific showdown, where the living confront their sins in a chilling reckoning. Part 1. The wealthy household of Mr. Leland. The Leland estate loomed over the vast countryside like a shadow, a testament to its owner's wealth and power. Mr. Leland, a man of imposing stature and commanding presence, had risen through the ranks of society, earning himself not only riches but also fear and respect. His land stretched as far as the eye could see, and his influence reached every corner of the region. But despite his wealth, despite his power, there was one thing he had yet to secure: a son. The sprawling mansion was a monument to Mr. Leland's obsession with legacy. Every inch of it had been designed to reflect his desire for immortality, his name, his bloodline, his fortune passed down through generations. But that dream was slipping further from his grasp with every passing year, and the frustration had long since begun to fester in his soul like a poison. His first 2 wives, Martha and Sarah, had failed him. They had given him daughters, pretty, obedient girls, but daughters nonetheless, and daughters could not carry his name. They could not be heirs. The weight of disappointment clung to him like a second skin, and his gaze often turned toward his 3rd wife, Anne, the youngest and most beautiful of them all. Anne had been a bright, hopeful addition to the household, a breath of fresh air among the stifling routines of the mansion. But her presence, her youth, her very existence had only deepened the fractures that ran through the Leland household. Martha and Sarah, once bitter rivals for their husband's favor, had found common ground in their shared resentment for Anne. The older wives, once hopeful that they might still rise to become the most cherished, had been relegated to the sidelines as soon as Anne stepped foot in the estate. Though they still commanded authority within the household, they were no longer the center of Mr. Leland's attention. That honor now belonged to the young woman whose very existence threatened the delicate balance they had maintained for so long. But Anne's greatest transgression was not her beauty, her youth, or even her charm. It was her pregnancy. The growing tension. News of Anne's pregnancy had sent shockwaves through the mansion. For weeks, the house had buzzed with speculation. Servants whispered in hushed tones about the possibility of a male heir. The older wives, Martha and Sarah, had felt the noose tightening around their necks with every passing day. A song would be their undoing, a force that would strip them of what little power and influence they still held. As the months passed and Anne's belly swelled, the tension within the house became unbearable. Every glance exchanged between the wives carried an undercurrent of hostility. Conversations were laced with barbed words and thinly veiled threats, but the true danger lay in the silence between them, the moments when Anne would catch Sarah's cold, calculating eyes watching her, or when Martha's lips would twitch into a smile that never reached her eyes. Anne, once vibrant and full of life, had become a shadow of her former self, weighed down not just by the child she carried, but by the oppressive atmosphere that surrounded her. She knew she was unwelcome in this house, that her presence had upset a delicate equilibrium. She had hoped that her child would bring joy, would unite the fractured family, but the closer she came to giving birth, the more she realized how wrong she had been taught every night. She lay awake in her grand bedroom, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house, feeling the weight of something dark and malicious settling over her. She could feel the eyes of the other wives on her, even in her sleep. She knew they hated her, and she knew with a bone-deep certainty that they would do anything to prevent her from giving Mr. Leland what he desired most, a son, the master of the house. Mr. Leland, oblivious to the poisonous undercurrents swirling through his household, remained singularly focused on the child Anne carried. His obsession with having a male heir had consumed him, clouding his judgment and blinding him to the growing danger within his own walls. He had waited too long, and now, with the birth of his son within reach, he would not be denied. He spent hours in his study, poring over documents and charts, planning the future that his son would inherit. His fortune was vast, his lands extensive, but without a son, it was all meaningless. His daughters, though dutiful, were not equipped to carry on his legacy. He had resigned himself to this fact long ago, but with Anne's pregnancy, hope had been rekindled. He had chosen Anne precisely for this reason: her youth, her health, her ability to bear him the son his other wives had failed to produce. Whenever he visited Anne, his usually stern face softened, if only for a moment. He would place a hand on her swollen belly, his eyes bright with the promise of the future. Anne smiled, though she felt uneasy under his intense gaze. His love was not for her, not really. It was for the life she carried inside her, for the son she would deliver. Anne was merely a vessel. "I want to see him grow strong," Mr. Leland would say, his voice low and reverent. "I want him to inherit everything." His words made Anne's skin prickle. She wondered, sometimes, what would happen if the child she carried wasn't a boy. Would Mr. Leland's tenderness disappear? Would he cast her aside like the others, another failed wife who couldn't give him what he desired most? The thought kept her awake at night, her mind racing with possibilities, but deep down she knew it wouldn't matter. It wasn't just Mr. Leland's affection at stake, it was her very survival. A brewing storm. As Anne's pregnancy neared its end, the atmosphere in the house grew more charged. Like the air before a thunderstorm, there was an unspoken understanding between Martha and Sarah that if a son was born, their days of influence would be over. No longer would they be able to manipulate Mr. Leland with their clever words and subtle alliances. No longer would they be able to assert their authority over the servants or the household itself. The birth of a son would render them obsolete, and the thought was unbearable. The older wives rarely spoke to one another now, but their silences were far more dangerous than any words they could exchange. In their minds, plans were forming, plans that would ensure their survival, no matter the cost. Neither woman wanted to be the one to suggest it, but both knew what had to be done. A boy could not be allowed to live, not if they were to keep their place in this household. Every night, as the servants retired and the house grew quiet, Martha and Sarah's thoughts turned darker. Their dreams were filled with visions of power slipping through their fingers, of Anne sitting in the place they had fought so hard to maintain. But these were not the worst dreams. The worst were the ones where the child was born a boy, healthy and strong, with Mr. Leland's features and the future of the estate in his tiny hands. In those dreams they were cast out, forgotten, their power stripped away in an instant. "We cannot let it happen," Martha whispered one night, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Sarah didn't respond, but her silence was answer enough. The storm was coming. They could feel it. The calm before the birth. As Anne neared her time, the tension in the house reached unbearable levels. The servants scurried about their tasks with heads down, unwilling to draw the attention of the wives. Mr. Leland spent his days in his study, oblivious to the growing malice that clung to the very walls of his home. Only Anne felt the weight of it, the dark cloud that seemed to settle over her as each day passed. Her once bright and hopeful demeanor had dimmed, replaced by a constant feeling of dread. She felt isolated, trapped within the confines of the house, and though she longed for the child she carried, she feared the consequences of his birth. One evening as she lay in bed, her thoughts swirling with anxiety, a sharp pain gripped her abdomen. It was time. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to breathe, to focus. She called for the midwife, her voice barely more than a whisper. As the contractions began to intensify, the storm outside finally broke, rain lashing against the windows and thunder rumbling in the distance. The house seemed to shudder with each clap of thunder, as if it too were anticipating the events to come. The midwife arrived quickly, her experienced hands guiding Anne through the pain. But with each passing moment, Anne's fear grew. She knew the birth of this child would not be a joyous occasion, not for everyone. And she knew, deep in her bones, that Martha and Sarah were not far. They were waiting for their chance. The storm outside raged on, but inside the Leland estate, something far darker was brewing. Part 2. Anne's labor and the plot against her. The storm outside grew fiercer, as if nature itself had sensed the turmoil about to unfold within the grand Leland estate. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the vast mansion for brief, flickering moments, casting twisted shadows across its towering walls. Inside, the air was thick with tension, anticipation, and something darker, something sinister. For tonight was not just a night of birth, but a night where jealousy, greed, and malice would converge into an act of unspeakable cruelty. In her bedchamber, Anne clutched her swollen belly as the first contraction tore through her. Her body was slick with sweat, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She cried out in pain, her voice echoing down the empty corridors. The midwife rushed to her side, her experienced hand soothing but firm, guiding Anne through the labor. Yet Anne's wide, fearful eyes revealed a different kind of terror, one that went beyond the physical pain of childbirth. She knew she wasn't just bringing a child into the world, she was bringing him into a nest of vipers. As the storm battered the mansion, its winds howling like wolves at the door, Martha and Sarah sat in the drawing room, their faces hidden in the dim light of flickering candles. The tension between them was palpable, their expressions grim, eyes sharp with calculated malice. Each of them knew that, with Anne's labor, the delicate balance of power in the household was about to tip. They had lost their place in Mr. Leland's affections long ago, replaced by the youthful, beautiful Anne. But if she bore a son, it would be their final undoing. A son would mean everything. It would secure Anne's position in the family, elevating her above them in every way. The boy would inherit the Leland estate, the fortune, the legacy, and with that, Anne would become untouchable. Martha and Sarah's fates would be sealed, doomed to live in the shadows, forgotten and discarded. They would not allow that to happen. Martha broke the silence first, her voice low and venomous. "We can't let this happen, Sarah. You know that." Sarah, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, nodded without looking up. "If she gives him a son, we're done. We're nothing." Martha's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "Then the child mustn't live." The words hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. There it was spoken aloud, the dark, horrible truth of what they both desired. Neither of them flinched. They had known it for weeks, had rehearsed this conversation in their minds 100 times. They were bound not by friendship, but by a shared desperation to maintain their place in the household. And they were willing to do whatever it took to preserve their crumbling influence. The labor. Upstairs, Anne writhed in agony as another contraction racked her body. She gripped the sheets, her nails digging into the fabric as the pain intensified. The midwife leaned over her, wiping the sweat from her brow, murmuring words of encouragement. Anne's heart raced, fear clawing at her throat. She knew the dangers of childbirth, knew that women sometimes didn't survive the ordeal. But her fear wasn't just for herself, it was for the life of the child she carried. The midwife, whose hands had delivered countless babies over the years, suddenly paused, her brow furrowing. Her eyes widened as she turned to Anne, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy Anne's breath caught in her throat. A son. Her heart swelled with relief and fear all at once. This was what Mr. Leland had been waiting for, a male heir, someone to carry on the family name, to inherit everything. But even as joy threatened to rise within her, a cold dread settled in her stomach. She knew what this meant. She knew how much danger this placed her and her newborn in. She closed her eyes, her mind racing. Would this child's birth secure her future or doom her to an early grave? The answer lay not in the hands of fate, but in the hands of those who waited in the shadows, plotting. The plot unfolds. Martha and Sarah stood just outside the room, their faces pale but determined. They had waited long enough, biding their time as Anne struggled through labor. Now, they knew the moment had come to act. Sarah held a small vial in her trembling hands, its contents a thick, dark liquid that reeked of death. A poison, subtle and silent, designed to end a life before it even began. "Are you ready?" Martha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, though her heart pounded in her chest. "It has to be done," she muttered, more to herself than to Martha. The two women moved swiftly, slipping into Anne's room like shadows. The midwife looked up as they entered, her expression one of surprise, but there was no time for questions. Martha crossed the room, her movements deliberate, as Sarah approached the midwife. "Give her this," Sarah said, thrusting the vial into the midwife's hand. "It will ease her pain." The midwife hesitated, her instinct screaming that something was wrong. The liquid in the vial was thick, too thick, and it smelled of something unnatural. She glanced at Anne, whose face was pale and drawn with exhaustion. But Sarah's gaze was cold, unwavering, and the midwife knew better than to question the older wives. With trembling hands, she uncorked the vial and poured the contents into a cup. She approached Anne, who lay panting on the bed, her body trembling from the exertion of labor. "Drink this," the midwife whispered, holding the cup to Anne's lips. Anne's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. She parted her lips and sipped the liquid, wincing at its bitter taste. It wasn't long before she felt the effects, the warmth spreading through her limbs, dulling the pain, and with it, her awareness. Her vision blurred, her head growing heavy, as if a great weight had been placed upon her chest. What is she murmured, her words slurring. Martha stepped forward, her face a mask of faint concern. "Rest, dear Anne," she said softly, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You've done so well." Anne's heart pounded in her chest as darkness closed in around her. She tried to fight it, tried to stay awake, but her body betrayed her. Her limbs grew heavy, her eyes sliding shut as the poison took hold. The midwife watched in horror, her hands shaking as she realized what had just happened. But it was too late to stop it, the murder of the innocent. The room was deathly silent, save for the soft, uneven breathing of Anne and the newborn's faint cries. The midwife, now understanding the gravity of what she had been forced to do, backed away from the bed, her eyes wide with terror. Martha and Sarah exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening. The time had come. Sarah, her hands trembling, approached the crib where the newborn boy lay. His tiny face, flushed from the effort of entering the world, was a picture of innocence. She reached down, her fingers brushing against the soft skin of his cheek. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, hesitation perhaps. But it was quickly extinguished. "We can't let him lie," Martha hissed from behind her. To it, Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her throat tight as she reached for the cloth beside the crib. Her hands shook, but she steeled herself. This was survival. This was necessary. With one swift motion, she pressed the cloth over the baby's face, smothering his tiny cries. His small body struggled, but only for a moment. Then, silence. Martha exhaled, her shoulders relaxing as if a great weight had been lifted. She turned to the midwife, her expression cold and calculating. "Tell Mr. Leland that the child didn't survive," she said. It was too much for her, the midwife, her heart pounding, nodded numbly. She knew she had no choice. These women were powerful, and she was just a servant. She would be next if she refused. and lay still in the bed, unconscious and unaware of the horrors that had just unfolded around her. But as the storm raged outside, the winds howling like banshees in the night, the house seemed to groan under the weight of its own darkness. Something had shifted, something unnatural. A storm within. The murder of an innocent child, the destruction of a mother, the lies that now threaded through the very foundation of the Leland household, these were acts that could not be undone. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the mansion, a new storm had begun to brew, one that neither Martha nor Sarah could ever have anticipated. The air in the room felt colder, the shadows longer. The mansion itself seemed to hum with a quiet, sinister energy, as if the house had borne witness to the atrocity and was now watching, waiting. Neither Martha nor Sarah noticed the change, not yet, but they would. Soon, they would realize that death was only the beginning of their nightmare. For something had awoken that night, something vengeful, something that would stop at nothing to take back what had been stolen. Part 3. The tragic death of Anne and her son. The air inside the Leland estate was thick with the scent of rain and something far more sinister, a sense of impending doom. The storm outside had not yet abated. Instead, it seemed to gather strength, its winds howling through the cracks of the mansion, rattling windows, and stirring shadows across its ancient walls. Lightning split the sky in jagged flashes, casting an eerie, fleeting light on the faces of those within, who were about to commit a crime so cold and calculated that nature itself seemed to recoil in protest. In her grand bedchamber, Anne lay weak and pale, her body ravaged by the agony of childbirth. Her once radiant face was now ashen, and her breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. The sheets beneath her were soaked with blood, and the midwife, with hands trembling, had tried everything in her power to stop the bleeding. But it was clear to anyone who looked at Anne that she was fading, slipping further away with each passing moment. And yet, amidst the unbearable pain and weakness, there had been a glimmer of joy, a brief moment where Anne had cradled her newborn son, holding him close to her chest. His tiny body, warm and fragile, had been a beacon of hope amidst the darkness. He had cried a strong, healthy wail that echoed through the room, and for just an instant, Anne had felt the weight of her struggles lift. She had given Mr. Leland what he desired most, a son, an heir to carry on his name. But that joy was fleeting. For the moment the boy had drawn breath, the wheels of a darker fate had already begun to turn. The final betrayal. Martha and Sarah had waited, lurking just outside the room like vultures, their eyes gleaming with malice. They had been informed by the midwife that the child was a boy, and with that news, their fate had been sealed. A male heir would strip them of their power, reduce them to mere footnotes in the grand story of the Leland estate. They had fought too long, too hard to be cast aside now, and so, as Anne's weakened cries filled the air, they exchanged a glance, a silent agreement that this child could not live. Anne, still delirious from the pain, barely registered the presence of the two older wives as they entered her room. Martha, her lips twisted into a cruel smile, moved closer to the bed where Anne lay. Sarah followed, her movements stiff with tension, her eyes darting to the crib where the baby slept. Martha leaned over Anne, her voice dripping with false concern. "Oh, poor Anne," she whispered, her breath hot against Anne's cheek. "You must be so tired. You've worked so hard to give us this precious boy." Anne's vision blurred, her mind foggy from the blood loss, but she sensed the danger, the venom in Martha's words. She tried to speak, to ask them to leave, but her throat was too dry, her body too weak. Her limbs felt like lead, refusing to move. Panic surged through her, but there was nothing she could do, no strength left to fight. Sarah, meanwhile, had made her way to the crib, her face pale as she stared down at the sleeping child. He was so small, so innocent, completely unaware of the fate that awaited him. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the cloth draped over the side of the crib, her heart pounding in her chest. "This has to be done," she muttered under her breath, as if trying to convince herself. "He can't survive. Etchy ... Etchy can't, Martha. Hearing Sarah's hesitation, turned her cold gaze about her. "Do it, Sarah," she hissed, "or we both lose everything, the murder of innocence." Sarah swallowed hard, the cloth now clutched tightly in her hands. Her fingers twitched, and for a brief moment she thought of backing away, of sparing the child. But then she saw it her future, crumbling into nothing if this boy were to live. She would be forgotten, cast aside, and Anne would take her place at Mr. Leland's side, the mother of the heir. The thought was unbearable. With a sudden, desperate resolve, she stepped forward and pressed the cloth firmly over the baby's face. His tiny body jerked, startled awake by the sudden lack of air. His limbs flailed helplessly, his cries muffled beneath the cloth. Sarah's hand shook violently, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she did not let go. The baby's struggles grew weaker, his tiny fists unclenching, until finally he lay still. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah backed away from the crib, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with horror at what she had done, but there was no turning back now. The deed was done. Martha, her face alight with cruel satisfaction, turned back to Anne, who had watched the entire scene through a haze of pain and delirium. Tears streamed down Anne's cheeks, her lips trembling as she tried to speak, but no sound came. She was too weak, too far gone to stop them, and the realization that she had failed to protect her child tore through her with a pain far worse than anything her body had endured during childbirth. Martha's smile widened as she watched the light fade from Anne's eyes. There she cooed mockingly, brushing a strand of hair from Anne's forehead. "It's better this way, don't you think? No more pain, no more suffering." Anne's breath hitched, her body trembling as she struggled to stay conscious. She wanted to scream, to fight, but her strength had abandoned her. All she could do was lie there, helpless, as the life drained from her body, her heart broken and shattered beyond repair, sealing Anne's fate. The moments stretched out like a cruel eternity as Anne's life slipped away. Martha, ever the saddest, could not resist twisting the knife one last time, you know. She whispered, leaning closer to Anne's ear, "Mr. Leland never truly loved you. He only wanted you for a boy. And now you're nothing." A tear slid down Anne's pale cheek, her chest heaving with labored breaths. She tried to speak, to defend herself, to fight back against Martha's poisonous words, but her voice was no more than a faint rasp. The world around her grew darker, the sounds of the storm outside muffling, as if she was sinking into deep water. Martha stood back, watching as Anne's body gave one final shudder. Her eyes, once filled with warmth and light, now stared blankly at the ceiling, glassy and unseeing. A harsh, final breath escaped her lips before her chest stilled. It was done. Both mother and child were gone. A convenient lie. As the storm continued to rage outside, the two older wives stood over the bodies of Anne and her newborn, their expressions cold and unreadable. The room was eerily quiet now, the air heavy with death. For a brief moment, neither of them moved, the gravity of what they had done sinking in. But the moment passed quickly, and the reality of their situation snapped them back to attention. "We'll tell Mr. Leland it was complications from the birth," Martha said, her voice steady and calm. "No one will question it. Women die in childbirth all the time." Sarah, still shaken from the act she had just committed, nodded mutely. She wanted to flee, to run far from the scene of their crime, but there was no escape now. She was complicit, tied to Martha in this web of lies and blood. The midwife, who had witnessed the entire tragedy in stunned silence, was trembling in the corner. Her face was pale, her hands shaking as she stared at the lifeless bodies. Martha turned her sharp gaze toward the midwife, her eyes narrowing. "You will tell Mr. Leland exactly what I said," Martha commanded. "Complications, nothing more." If you breathed a word of what really happened, she didn't need to finish the sentence. The threat was clear, and the midwife nodded quickly, her eyes wide with terror. Satisfied, Martha turned to leave the room, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor. Sarah followed, her movements stiff and robotic, as if she was still in a state of shock. They disappeared into the shadows, leaving the midwife alone with the bodies of the mother and her child. The midwife stared down at Anne's still form, her heart heavy with grief and guilt. She had failed. She had failed to protect the innocent, and now 2 lives had been stolen, snuffed out by the greed and malice of those who should have been family. The calm before the storm. By the time Mr. Leland was informed, the storm had begun to subside, leaving the mansion in an eerie stillness. He arrived at Anne's room with an expression of grave concern, but when he saw the midwife's tear-streaked face and heard the fabricated story of complications, his face crumbled into grief. "A boy," the midwife whispered, her voice trembling. But neither survived. Mr. Leland's broad shoulders sagged, the weight of his loss heavy on him. His heir, the boy he had longed for, was gone before he ever had the chance to hold him. His 3rd wife, Anne, lay dead in her bed, her face pale and peaceful, as though she had simply fallen asleep. To the world it seemed like a tragic consequence of childbirth, and all too common fate in those times. But beneath the surface, the truth festered, dark and ugly, like a cancer that would spread until it consumed everything. For that night, something far darker than mere death had been born in the Leland household. Death's silent watch. As the night wore on, the mansion grew still, but the air remained heavy with an unseen presence, something that lingered, watching, waiting. Martha and Sarah believed they had succeeded in their cruel plan, that their power and position were now secure. But they were wrong. The deaths of Anne and her son were not the end of the story. They were only the beginning. Part 4. The haunting begins. The Leland estate, once a symbol of wealth and stability, now stood under a heavy pall of dread. The grandeur that had defined it for generations seemed to fade, replaced by a sense of decay, as though the very walls were beginning to rot from the inside. The storm that had raged the night of Anne and her son's deaths had long since passed, leaving behind an eerie calm that settled over the mansion like a funeral shroud. But that calm was deceptive. For something far more sinister had taken root within those walls, something that no amount of wealth or power could dispel. It started innocently enough with small, almost imperceptible changes. The air inside the mansion grew colder, even though the weather outside had turned warm and balmy. Fires that had once roared in the hearths troubled to catch, and when they did, they flickered weakly, as though fighting against an unseen force. Servants whispered nervously about strange noises in the dead of night, footsteps echoing through the halls, faint whispers carried on the wind, and the distant, unmistakable sound of a baby crying. At first, Mr. Leland dismissed these rumors, attributing them to the heightened emotions in the wake of his wife and son's deaths. He believed that grief had driven his household to imagine ghosts where there were none. But deep down, even he could not ignore the strange sensations that had begun to gnaw at the edges of his mind. It felt as though the house itself was watching, waiting alive in a way it had never been before. But for Martha and Sarah, the disturbances were not just whispers or fleeting shadows. No, what plagued them was far more real, far more terrifying. The first nightmares. It began with the nightmares. Martha was the first to experience them. In the dark hours of the night, when the mansion was quiet and the world outside had gone still, she would drift into a restless sleep, only to be pulled into a vivid, hellish landscape. In these dreams, she found herself back in the room where Anne had died, standing over the crib where the baby lay. But in the dream, the baby was not still. His tiny body, bloodied and pale, reached for her, his eyes wide and accusing, his lips trembling with the silent question, why? Martha would wake with a scream lodged in her throat, her heart hammering in her chest, the baby's face still etched into her mind. She tried to shake off the dreams, convincing herself that they were simply the product of guilt, nothing more. But as the nights went on, the dreams grew more intense, more visceral. Anne began to appear in them as well, her face twisted in agony, her dress soaked in blood, her hollow, lifeless eyes stared into Martha's soul, burning with the rage of a mother who had been betrayed. Sarah too was not spared. Her dreams were just as haunting, though they came in different forms. In her sleep, she would wander the halls of the mansion, her footsteps echoing unnaturally in the silence. She knew she was searching for something, though she didn't know what, and then she would hear it, a soft, distant cry, the unmistakable sound of a baby calling for its mother. The sound would grow louder, more desperate, until it filled every corner of her mind, drowning out her thoughts. She would follow the sound, her heart racing with dread, until she reached the nursery door. But when she opened it, she would find nothing but darkness, cold and suffocating, wrapping itself around her like a vice. When Sarah woke from these dreams, her body was drenched in sweat, her throat raw from the screams she hadn't even realized she'd been making. The baby's cry still echoed in her ears, a sound that seemed to cling to the very air around her, even in the waking world, the sounds in the halls. As the days passed, the disturbances grew bolder. What had once been subtle, almost deniable, began to manifest in ways that could no longer be ignored. Footsteps echoed through the empty halls of the mansion at all hours of the day and night. They were slow, deliberate, the sound of bare feet on wooden floors. The servants, terrified, whispered that it was Anne, her restless spirit unable to leave the place where she had been so cruelly wronged. And always there was the faint cry of a baby, sometimes soft and pitiful, other times loud and demanding, as though it were calling out for someone to come and hold it, to comfort it. At first the sounds were distant, confined to the upper floors where Anna had died, but as the days went on, they grew closer, more insistent. The footsteps began to follow Martha and Sarah wherever they went, shadowing their every move, growing louder when they tried to ignore them. The baby's cries, once barely audible, now rang out clearly, piercing the silence of the mansion with a heart-wrenching wail that sent shivers down their spines. One night, as Martha lay in her bed, the footsteps grew so loud that it sounded as though someone was pacing just outside her door. She sat up, her heart pounding, straining to hear over the thudding of her pulse. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was only silence. Then, from the other side of the door, came a soft, breathless voice. Martha, it was Anne's voice. Martha's blood ran cold. She knew it was impossible. Anne was dead, buried in the family plot along with her newborn son. But the voice was unmistakable, filled with the same quiet grace that Anne had carried in life. Except now, it was laced with something darker, something dangerous. Martha ... Why did you do it? Martha froze, her throat tightening with fear. She couldn't answer. She couldn't even breathe. The door rattled on its hinges, as though someone or something was trying to get in. She clutched the blankets around her, trembling, as the voice outside grew louder, more insistent. You killed us, Martha. You killed us both. With a strangled cry, Martha scrambled out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floor as she ran to the door. She flung it open, expecting to see what? Anne's ghost, perhaps, or some other manifestation of her guilt. But the hallway was empty, save for the flickering shadows cast by the dying embers of the hearth. Still, the voice echoed in her mind, a taunting whisper that refused to leave her. The unseen presence. Sarah, too, had her own encounters with the unseen. One afternoon, as she was descending the grand staircase, she felt a sudden, unnatural chill in the air. It wrapped around her like icy fingers, making her skin prickle and her breath come out in shaky puffs of mist. She paused, gripping the banister tightly, her eyes darting around the hallway below. There was no one there, and yet thought she wasn't alone. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, as though a pair of eyes were fixed on her, burning holes into the back of her head. Slowly she turned, her heart thudding in her chest. For a moment she saw nothing, just the familiar grand staircase and the ornate walls of the mansion. But then, in the corner of her vision, she saw it. A figure stood at the top of the stairs. It was Anne. Her pale face was barely visible in the dim light, her eyes wide and empty, staring directly at Sarah. Her white dress, stained with blood, clung to her frail body, and in her arms she cradled the limp form of her child. His tiny head lowered against her chest, his skin as pale and lifeless as hers. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run, to flee from the sight before her, but her feet were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. Anne's eyes bore into hers, filled with a burning hatred that made Sarah's blood turn to ice. "Give him back," Anne whispered, her voice low and raspy. "Give me my son." Sarah stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet as she fled down the stairs. She didn't stop until she reached the drawing room, slamming the door shut behind her and pressing her back against it, her heart hammering in her chest. She stood there panting, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what she had seen. But there was no sense to be made. Anne was dead. The child was dead. And yet they were here, haunting her every step, demanding something she could never give. The descent into madness. As the hauntings grew more frequent, Martha and Sarah's grip on reality began to slip. They could no longer escape the ghosts that had taken up residence in their minds, twisting their thoughts, warping their perceptions. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of a candle, every gust of wind felt like a threat, a reminder that they could never be free of the crime they had committed. Martha spent her days locked in her room, her curtains drawn tight to keep out the light. She refused to eat, refused to speak to anyone, her once sharp mind unraveling with each passing day. She muttered to herself, rocking back and forth in her chair, her eyes wide and unblinking as she stared at the door, waiting for Anne's ghost to come for her. Sarah fared no better. She wandered the halls of the mansion aimlessly, her hands trembling, her eyes darting around as though she expected to see Anne lurking in every shadow. The baby's cries followed her wherever she went, a constant, unbearable reminder of what she had done. She no longer slept, too afraid of the nightmares that awaited her the moment she closed her eyes. The once grand Leland estate, with its polished floors and towering walls, had become a prison for the two women, a place of torment, where the past refused to stay buried and the dead refused to stay silent. The beginning of the end. The haunting of the Leland estate was only just beginning. What had started as a trickle of strange occurrences had grown into a flood, drowning the mansion in darkness and fear. The servants whispered of a curse, a blight upon the house that would not be lifted until justice had been served. And somewhere, deep within the shadows, Anne and her son waited. They would not rest. They could not rest. Not until those who had wronged them had paid the ultimate price. Part 5. The Ghost's First Appearance. The evening began like any other at the Leland estate. The grand dining room, once a place of laughter and prestige, now felt cold and barren, despite its opulent surroundings. Crystal chandeliers glittered above the long mahogany table, reflecting the flickering candlelight. The servants moved silently, their faces pale, their movements tense as they set the table for the evening meal. The air was heavy with an unspoken dread that hung over the household since Anne and her baby had perished under such tragic circumstances. Mr. Leland sat at the head of the table, his stern face showing signs of wear. He had changed since the death of his third wife and his only son, his once robust figure now gaunt, his sharp eyes dulled by grief. He had loved the idea of his heir more than the boy himself, but the loss had torn something deep inside him, his dreams of legacy shattered. Across the table sat Martha and Sarah, the surviving wives, their faces masks of serenity that barely concealed the guilt that gnawed at their souls. But tonight, the tension between the two women was palpable, their glances sharp and full of accusation. Neither spoke, and the clinking of silverware on porcelain was the only sound that filled the cavernous room. Outside, the wind howled, as though nature itself sensed the evil that had festered within the walls of the estate. Suddenly, as if on cue, the temperature in the room plummeted. It was as though an unseen force had sucked the warmth from the air, leaving behind a biting cold that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. The servants paused, confused, looking to each other for an explanation. Mr. Leland frowned, his eyes narrowing as he watched his breath puff out in front of him in ghostly tendrils. Without warning, the candles flickered once, then extinguished altogether. Darkness followed the room, save for the faint light from the storm outside, casting long shadows against the walls. The sudden shift in the atmosphere was immediate. The servants froze in place, wide-eyed with fear. Mr. Leland stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly across the marble floor. Martha and Sarah remained seated, too stunned to move, their hearts pounding in their chests. And then, out of the silence came a voice, low, chilling, and unmistakable. Giving back the words hung in the air like a death sentence. They seemed to reverberate from every corner of the room, filling the space with a suffocating sense of dread. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Martha gripped the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Mr. Leland's eyes widened in confusion, but before he could demand an explanation, a figure began to take shape in the darkness. It was a woman, a figure shrouded in shadow, but there was no mistaking her identity. Anne, the ghost's terrifying presence. Anne's ghost materialized at the far end of the dining room, her form translucent but unmistakable. Her once delicate features were now twisted in anguish, her eyes hollow and sunken, as though the life had been drained from her even beyond death. Her skin was a sickly, pale hue tinged with the grey of the grave of the grey, and her once flowing gown was stained with blood, clinging to her slender frame. But it was a bundle in her arms that sent a wave of icy terror through the room. She was holding the lifeless body of her baby. The child's limp form, small and fragile, lay cradled in Anne's arms, his face obscured by a blood-soaked blanket. His tiny hands, once so full of potential, now hung lifeless, and his body exuded the same coldness that had claimed the room. A low, keening wail echoed through the air, but it wasn't from the ghost, it was the distant cry of a baby, growing louder with every passing second. Martha and Sarah stared in abject horror, their mouths dry, their hearts hammering in their chests as the temperature dropped even further. The chill was unbearable, cutting through their flesh like icy blades. They tried to look away from the apparition, but their eyes were drawn to it, as though they were powerless to resist. Anne's gaze, once filled with kindness and grace, now blazed with an otherworldly fury. Her eyes locked onto Martha and Sarah, burning with hatred so intense it seemed to seep into the very walls of the mansion. She took a step forward, her movements slow and deliberate, her feet hovering just above the floor, leaving no sound in her wake. "Give him back," she repeated, her voice a guttural rasp, like the last breath of a dying woman. Martha's breath hitched in her throat. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the table, her mind reeling with the horror of what she was seeing. She knew, oh God, she knew that this was no mere hallucination. This was Anne, returned from the grave, and she had come for revenge. Sarah let out a strangled cry, stumbling backward in her chair, her body shaking with fear. She had seen this ghost before in her nightmares, in the dark corners of the mansion when she thought no one was watching. But seeing Anne now, so close, so real, was more than she could bear. Chaos unleashed. Panic erupted in the room. The servants, already unnerved by the sudden chill and darkness, shrieked in terror as Anne's ghost moved closer. Dishes crashed to the floor, and chairs were overturned as they fled, their footsteps pounding down the hallway, desperate to escape whatever malevolent force had been unleashed in the house. Mr. Leland, still rooted to the spot, could only watch in stunned disbelief as the chaos unfolded around him. His rational mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing, but the fear clawing at his chest was undeniable. Anne's ghost continued her slow, deliberate march toward the two women, her eyes never leaving them. The closer she came, the colder the room grew, until the very air felt as though it had turned to ice. Martha's teeth chattered, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her body paralyzed with terror. Sarah tried to scramble to her feet, but her legs gave out beneath her, sending her sprawling to the floor. She crawled backward, her hands slipping on the polished wood as she tried to put distance between herself and the ghost, but there was nowhere to run. Anne's spirit filled the room, an inescapable presence that seemed to consume everything in its path. "You took him from me," Anne hissed, her voice sharp and venomous. "You took my son." Her words were like daggers, piercing deep into Martha and Sarah's hearts. They had thought the crime would go unnoticed, that they could carry the secret of the baby's death to their graves. But they were wrong. Anne had returned, and she wanted retribution. No, Martha whispered, her voice trembling. No, please, but there was no mercy in Anne's gaze. She held the lifeless body of her child closer, her arms tightening around him protectively, as though even in death she sought to shield him from the cruelty of the world. Confronting the ghost, Mr. Leland finally found his voice, his mind snapping back to the present as the horror of the situation became clear. Anne, he shouted, stepping forward, his voice filled with disbelief. Anne, what is this? What are you doing? But the ghost did not respond to him. Her fury was not directed at Mr. Leland. He had been blind to the treachery that had unfolded in his own home. No, her wrath was reserved for the two women who had betrayed her, who had stolen the life of her child. With a sudden, unnatural speed, Anne lunged towards Sarah, her movements swift and fluid, like a shadow come to life. Sarah screamed, throwing her hands up in a futile attempt to defend herself, but it was no use. The cold, icy grip of Anne's hand closed around Sarah's wrist, her touch burning like frostbite. Feel what he felt, Anne whispered, her breath cold against Sarah's cheek. Feel the life drain from your body. Sarah's eyes widened in horror as the cold spread through her, seeping into her bones, freezing her from the inside out. Her limbs grew heavy, her skin turning pale and bluish as the temperature in her body plummeted. She gasped, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts, but no warmth would return. It was as though Anne was sucking the very life from her, one agonizing second at a time. Martha watched in shock, too paralyzed by fear to intervene. She had never imagined this a punishment so brutal, so absolute. She had believed that Anne's death would be the end of it, that the past would remain buried. But now, confronted with the vengeful spirit of the woman she had wronged, Martha realized a terrible truth. The dead do not rest. The descent into madness. The room descended into chaos as Anne's ghost continued her relentless pursuit of vengeance. The temperature dropped even further, frost forming on the windows, the floor slick with ice. The chandelier above the table shook violently, its crystals clinking together like the death knell of the Leland household. Mr. Leland, his mind unraveling, staggered backward, unable to comprehend the horror before him. He could no longer distinguish reality from nightmare. Everything felt wrong, twisted. His once proud estate, his legacy, was being torn apart by forces beyond his control. And at the center of it all was Anne, his beloved, wronged Anne, holding their lifeless child as she exacted her brutal revenge. Martha's screams filled the room as Anne's ghost turned her gaze toward her, the same icy cold reaching for her heart. But before Anne could claim her next victim, the sound of a baby's wail pierced the air once more. It was a cry so haunting, so filled with sorrow, that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The ghost of Anne paused, her expression softening for just a moment as she looked down at the baby in her arms. The wail grew louder, more insistent, filling every corner of the room with its mournful sound. And then, as suddenly as she had appeared, unvarnished, her form dissolving into the darkness, leaving behind only the echo of the baby's cries. The room was silent. Part 6. The Curse Unleashed. The days following Anne's terrifying apparition were nothing short of hell. The Leland estate, once filled with the echoes of polite conversation and the clatter of servants' footsteps, had now become a prison of fear. The air itself seemed to thrum with a malicious energy, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for the next inevitable horror to unfold. There was no peace, no escape. The hauntings had only just begun. Mirrors throughout the mansion began to crack without warning. It would start as a faint sound, a subtle creak, like ice breaking in the dead of winter. Then, all at once, the glass would shatter, splintering into a spiderweb of jagged lines, reflecting 1,000 distorted images of whoever dared to stand before them. The servants stopped using the mirrors altogether, too terrified to look into them, fearing they might catch a glimpse of Anne's hollow, bloodshot eyes staring back at them from the other side. And the voices were the worst. Whispers filled the hallways, soft, insidious murmurs that slithered through the air like snakes. At first they were too faint to make out, just the ghost of a sound that sent shivers down the spines of those who heard it. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, clearer. They called out in the dead of night, repeating the same chilling refrain over and over again. Give him back. It was Anne's voice, low, guttural, filled with a deep, unrelenting fury. The words echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls, seeping into the minds of everyone who heard them. Even Mr. Leland, who had stubbornly refused to believe in such things, was not immune. He would wake in a cold sweat, the words still ringing in his ears, his heart pounding with a terror he could not explain. For Martha and Sarah, there was no reprieve. The guilt of their crime hung over them like a storm cloud, and Anne's spirit pursued them relentlessly, as though feeding off their fear, growing stronger with each passing day. Martha's descent into madness. Martha had always prided herself on her strength. She had been the first wife, the one who had secured her place in the household through careful manipulation and cold calculation. But now, all of her power, all of her control was slipping away. She had never truly believed in ghosts, not until Anne had appeared at the dining table, holding her lifeless child in her arms, her face twisted in a mask of rage. Since that night, Martha had not been able to sleep. The nightmares were relentless, dragging her back into that room, that moment when they had taken Anne's son. She could feel the weight of the baby in her arms, hear his last gasping breath as Sarah had smothered him. She could see Anne's eyes, wide and filled with terror as she bled out on the bed, too weak to stop them. But the nightmares were not the worst of it. No, it was the moments when Martha was awake that truly broke her. She would be walking through the halls of the estate, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, when she would hear a faint cry, like the wail of a newborn. It would start softly, just a whisper on the wind, but then it would grow louder, more desperate, until it filled the entire room, suffocating her with its need. Martha would cover her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The crying followed her wherever she went, an inescapable reminder of what she had done. Sometimes she would look down and see blood on her hands, warm and sticky, dripping onto the floor in thick, crimson pools. No matter how much she scrubbed, how much she tried to wash it away, the blood remained, a constant stain on her soul. It wasn't long before Martha stopped leaving her room altogether. She locked herself away, refusing to see anyone, refusing to acknowledge the horrors that were unfolding around her. The curtains were drawn tight, the room bathed in darkness, save for the faint glow of candlelight that flickered weakly in the corner. She sat in her chair, rocking back and forth, muttering to herself, her eyes wide and unblinking as she stared at the door, waiting for the inevitable. And then, in the dead of night, the whispers would come. Martha. Give him back. She would close her eyes, squeezing them shut as tightly as she could, but it didn't matter. The voice was inside her head now, a relentless chorus of blame, an accusation that would not be silenced. Anne's face would appear in her mind, bloodied and broken, her eyes hollow with death, as she cradled her dead son in her arms. You killed us both. Martha's sanity unraveled thread by thread, until there was nothing left but the shell of the woman she had once been. The strong, calculating Martha was gone, replaced by a quivering wreck, consumed by the ghosts of her past. Sarah's desperate flight. Sarah had always been the more pragmatic of the two. While Martha descended into madness, Sarah tried to maintain control, to find a way to end the torment that had befallen them. But no matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried to rationalize the events that were unfolding, there was no escaping the truth. Anne was coming for them. The hauntings grew more intense with each passing day. Objects moved on their own, books flew from shelves, and doors slammed shut without warning. Shadows flitted through the hallways, dark and indistinct, but always there watching, waiting. The air in the mansion was thick with malevolence, a palpable sense of dread that seemed to seep into Sarah's very bones, but it was Anne's presence that haunted Sarah the most. She could feel her in the house, a cold, oppressive force that seemed to follow her wherever she went. The baby's cries were constant now, echoing through the walls, through Sarah's mind, until she could no longer think, no longer breathe without hearing it. Desperation clawed at her, and in a moment of panic she made the decision to flee. She couldn't stay in the estate any longer. It was cursed, haunted by the dead, and if she didn't leave, she knew she would suffer the same fate as Anne and her child. One stormy night, Sarah gathered what little courage she had left and fled into the forest that bordered the estate. The rain poured down in sheets, soaking her to the bone as she stumbled through the trees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know where she was going, she only knew that she had to get as far away from the house as possible. But the forest was not a sanctuary. It was a labyrinth of shadows and twisted branches, and Sarah soon realized that something was following her. She could hear the rustle of leaves behind her, the snap of twigs, the soft, steady footfalls of someone or something trailing her every move. Panic surged through her, and she broke into a run, her heart pounding in her chest. But no matter how fast she ran, the presence behind her grew closer, relentless in its pursuit. The baby's cries filled the air, louder than ever, mingling with the howling wind and the crack of thunder. And then, through the trees, she saw it, Anne. The ghost stood at the edge of the forest, her pale form illuminated by the flashes of lightning. She was holding her baby, just as she had at the dinner table, her eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that sent waves of terror crashing over her. "Give him back," Anne whispered, her voice carrying over the storm, cutting through the noise like a blade. Sarah's scream echoed through the forest as Anne's figure began to advance, her movements slow and deliberate, her feet gliding over the ground as though she were floating. The baby in her arms let out a wail, and Sarah's legs buckled beneath her, sending her crashing to the forest floor. The last thing Sarah saw before the darkness claimed her was Anne's bloodied face, twisted in a mask of vengeance. The vanishing. When the storm cleared the next morning, the estate was eerily quiet. Sarah was gone. The servants searched the grounds, scouring the forest for any sign of her, but she had vanished without a trace. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed her whole, leaving behind nothing but the faint echo of her last terrified scream. Some said she had run away, driven mad by guilt and fear. Others whispered that Anne had taken her, dragged her into the darkness to exact her revenge. But whatever the truth, Sarah was never seen again. The curse tightens its grip. With Sarah gone and Martha locked away in a self-imposed prison, the estate fell into ruin. The once grand halls were now silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant sound of a door slamming shut. The servants, too terrified to stay, fled one by one, leaving only Mr. Leland behind, a broken man in a cursed house. But the hauntings did not cease. They intensified. Anne's presence was everywhere now, an unrelenting force that could not be stopped. The baby's cries echoed through the empty rooms, a constant reminder of the lives that had been stolen. The mirrors continued to crack, shattering the reflections of anyone foolish enough to look into them. And Martha. Poor, wretched Martha. She remained locked in her room, muttering to herself, her mind long since broken by the weight of her guilt. She would not leave. She could not leave. For Anne was waiting, just beyond the door, her cold dead eyes watching, waiting for the moment when she would finally claim her vengeance. The curse of the Leland estate had been unleashed, and there would be no escape. Not for Martha, not for anyone. Part 7. Mr. Leland's downfall. At first Mr. Leland was oblivious. The house could have collapsed around him, and it would have hardly made a dent in his hardened, unfeeling demeanor. He'd built his life on a foundation of power and wealth, accustomed to getting everything he wanted without consequence. And in his eyes the hauntings were merely the hysterics of the women who surrounded him. First Martha's endless, sleepless nights. Then Sarah's irrational fear, leading her to vanish into the storm. It was all noise, distractions from his true concern, his legacy, now tainted with the tragedy of Anne's death. But something shifted in the air, something darker, more vicious, and Mr. Leland could no longer ignore it. The mansion itself seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. It was as though the very walls were closing in on him, whispering secrets he did not want to hear. Footsteps that did not belong to anyone living echoed in the corridors, growing louder, closer. The wind, when it blew, carried whispers Anne's voice, distant at first, barely perceptible, like the memory of a forgotten dream. But slowly, steadily, her voice grew, louder and louder, piercing the fragile veneer of sanity he still clung to. A mind unraveling. It started with the mirrors. One morning, as Mr. Leland was shaving in front of the grand mirror in his chamber, he caught something out of the corner of his eye, a flicker, a flash of movement. His hand paused, the blade hovering near his throat, as he turned to look more closely. The mirror showed only his reflection, his face worn and tired from the weight of recent events. But behind him, in the shadows of the room, something stirred. He spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing. The room was empty, save for the cold draft that sent shivers down his spine. With a huff of irritation, he turned back to the mirror, only to find it cracked thin, hairline fractures spreading outward like a spider's web, distorting his face into something grotesque, something not entirely his own. That was the first crack in his sanity. He tried to dismiss it, tried to explain it away. Perhaps the glass had weakened over time, or a draft had caused it to crack. But deep down, a cold knot of fear tightened in his chest. He knew what it was. Anne. Her presence in the house had become undeniable. He could feel her, hovering just out of sight, waiting, watching. And with every day that passed, her hold on him grew stronger. The nights of terror began. At night, Mr. Leland would lie awake in his massive four-poster bed, staring up at the ceiling. The silence pressed in around him, thick and suffocating. Sleep was an elusive thing, slipping through his grasp no matter how exhausted he was. He told himself it was just grief, just the weight of losing his son, his heir, that kept him awake. But he knew better. It was Anne. The nights were the worst. It began with the soft creaking of floorboards, as though someone was walking through the house, someone who shouldn't be there. At first he thought it was a servant, perhaps Martha, though she hadn't left her room in days. But the footsteps were too deliberate, too purposeful, as if they were searching for something, or someone. Then came the voices. They were faint at first, nothing more than whispers that barely registered in his mind. But as the nights wore on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became a chorus of voices calling his name. After it was Anne's voice, he was sure of it. She was calling to him, her voice thick with grief, with anger. She wanted something from him, something he could not give. Arthur, where is he? Give him back. Mr. Leland sat bolt upright in bed, sweat dripping down his forehead despite the chill in the air. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the sliver of moonlight creeping through the curtains. The voice had come from inside the room. His breath hitched in his throat as he scanned the darkness, his heart racing. Anne, he whispered, his voice trembling despite himself. There was no answer, just the sound of the wind howling outside. But he knew she was there, just beyond the veil of the living, waiting for him to make a mistake, the descent into madness. The days blurred together in a hash of fear and confusion. Mr. Leland could no longer tell where reality ended and the nightmares began. He would catch glimpses of Anne throughout the house, her pale face, blood-stained and gaunt, staring at him from the end of the hallway, her cold, dead eyes locking onto his as if daring him to look away. But when he blinked, she was gone, leaving only the echo of her presence behind. And always he could hear the baby. It was faint, just a soft, pitiful cry at first, but it grew louder with each passing day. The wails would echo through the house, seeping through the walls, invading his mind until he could think of nothing else. It was as if the house itself had become a tomb, haunted by the ghost of his dead child, crying out for a justice that would never come. But the worst of it came when he was alone, locked in his study, trying to regain some semblance of control over his crumbling life. That's when the whispers would start again, curling around him like smoke, suffocating him with their malice. You let her die, you could have saved him, they won't rest until you pay the trance. It was on one of these endless, sleepless nights that Mr. Leland finally broke. He was found wandering the halls of the mansion in a daze, his eyes glazed over, his mouth moving as though he was speaking to someone only he could see. The servants watched him with growing fear, exchanging worried glances but saying nothing. Mr. Leland had become a shadow of his former self, his once proud and commanding presence reduced to a fragile, terrified shell of a man. He would pace the halls for hours, muttering to himself, his eyes wide and wild as if he were seeing things that weren't there. Anne, I'm sorry, he would whisper, his voice trembling. I didn't know. At times he would stop abruptly, as though someone had called his name, and he would turn, his eyes scanning the empty air, as if expecting to see Anne standing there, her cold gaze fixed on him. His hands would tremble, his breath come in short, panic bursts, and then he would start walking again, his feet dragging across the floor as though the weight of his guilt had become too much to bear. The collapse one night. The servants found Mr. Leland collapsed in the grand foyer, his body slumped against the wall, his eyes glazed and unseeing. He was muttering to himself, his voice barely a whisper, but the words sent chills down their spines. Anne, the baby. I'm sorry. He had been found like this before, wandering the halls in a trance, but this time was different. This time he was beyond reach. His mind had snapped, broken by the weight of his guilt and the relentless torment of the hauntings. The man who had once commanded respect and fear was now nothing more than a husk, haunted by the ghosts of his past. The servants tried to help him, tried to rouse him from his stupor, but it was no use. He was lost, trapped in a nightmare of his own making, doomed to relive the tragedy of Anne and the baby over and over again, the end of Arthur Leland. From that day forward, Mr. Leland was never the same. He no longer ate, no longer slept. He would sit for hours in his study, staring blankly at the wall, his lips moving soundlessly as he muttered to himself. He had become a prisoner in his own mind, tormented by the ghosts of those he had wronged. And always he would hear the baby's cries. The estate, once grand and opulent, fell into disrepair. The servants left one by one, too afraid to stay in the cursed house any longer. The once bustling mansion was now silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the soft, pitiful wail of a child that echoed through the empty halls. Mr. Leland was left alone in the darkness, his mind shattered, his soul consumed by the ghosts that haunted him. He would wander the house aimlessly, calling out to Anne, begging for her forgiveness, but she never answered. In the end, he was found in the same grand foyer where he had collapsed so many nights before. His body was cold, his face twisted in a final expression of terror. His hands were clenched around his throat, as though he had been trying to choke the life out of himself, but there were no marks, no signs of struggle. It was as if the ghosts had finally claimed him. And so, the once proud and powerful Mr. Leland met his end, a broken man, haunted by the tragedy of his own making. The house, now abandoned, stood as a monument to his downfall, its halls echoing with the cries of a baby that would never rest. Arthur Leland's legacy, once built on power and wealth, had crumbled into dust, consumed by the curse he could not escape. Part 8. The Fate of the Wives. The once grand and opulent Leland estate had descended into a place of dread and doom. Its halls, which once echoed with the sounds of servants and laughter, were now filled with an oppressive silence, broken only by the soft whispers of the dead. Anne's spirit was everywhere, unseen yet undeniably present, her cold rage twisting the very air and choking the life out of all who remained within. And at the heart of it all, trapped in the madness she had helped create, was Martha, the first wife. Martha's descent into madness. Martha had always been proud, calculated, a woman who had survived by staying one step ahead of those around her. She had weathered the many storms of life with Mr. Leland and had believed that she would outlast anyone who threatened her position. But now she found herself trapped physically and mentally by a force far greater than anything she could have anticipated. After the death of Anne and the child, Martha had retreated to her room, thinking that she could shut the door and close out the horrors that lurked beyond. She believed the walls would keep her safe, that the weight of her guilt could be locked away just as easily as the door to her chamber. But the truth was far more terrifying. The nights were the worst. That's when Anne would come to her. At first it was subtle, a chill in the air, the flicker of a candle's flame, even though no breeze could reach inside the room. Martha would lie in her bed, clutching the blankets to her chest, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house settling in the night. But then she would hear it, the faint, unmistakable sound of footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate. They would start down the hall, distant at first, but then with every passing second, they grew closer. The wooden floorboards would creak under the weight of something or someone approaching. Martha's breath would catch in her throat. She would stare at the door, praying that it wouldn't open, that Anne's ghostly figure wouldn't materialize in the doorway. But deep down, she knew that no door, no lock, no earthly barrier could keep out the dead. Martha. The voice was like a whisper carried on the wind, but it echoed inside her head with the force of a scream. It was Anne's voice, low, cold, filled with the promise of retribution. The door wouldn't open, not that night. Anne never showed herself right away. No, she was more patient than that. She wanted Martha to unravel slowly, to feel the terror seep into her bones like ice. Martha, you took him. Martha would squeeze her eyes shut, pulling the blankets over her head, like a child trying to hide from a nightmare. But there was no escaping Anne's voice, no hiding from the sound of the baby's cries that followed. The infant's wails were piercing, echoing through the walls, filling the room with their mournful, accusing tone. It was as if the baby were in the room with her, crying out for the life that had been stolen from him. Martha's hands would fly to her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The cries were inside her head, relentless, driving her closer to the brink with every passing night. The visions began soon after. Martha would wake in the dead of night. The room bathed in the pale, cold light of the moon. She would glance toward the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, like long bony fingers reaching for her. And there, in the darkness, she would see them, Anne and the baby. Anne's eyes were hollow, her face a mask of death, streaked with blood and grief. She held the baby in her arms, its tiny form limp and pale, its lifeless eyes staring directly into Martha's soul. "Give him back," Martha would scream, her voice hoarse from terror, but the vision never faltered. Anne would simply stare at her, the ghostly baby clutched to her chest, before slowly fading into the shadows. But the fear remained. It clawed at Martha's mind, pulling her deeper into the abyss of madness. She stopped leaving her room altogether, convinced that the moment she stepped outside, Anne would be waiting for her. The servants stopped checking on her after a while. They were too afraid. They whispered amongst themselves, speaking of curses and vengeful spirits. And all the while, Martha sat in a darkened room, rocking back and forth, her eyes wide and unblinking, as she waited for the next visit from Anne and the baby. Sarah's desperate escape. While Martha crumbled into madness, Sarah, the second wife, chose a different path. She refused to be another victim of the hauntings, refused to let Anne's spirit destroy her. She was younger, stronger, and more determined to survive than Martha had ever been. But that determination would soon be tested in ways she could never have imagined. The first sign that Anne was coming for her was a cold breeze that snaked through the estate, chilling Sarah to the bone. She had been sitting in the drawing room, her hands trembling as she sipped her tea, when she saw it, Anne's reflection in the glass. It was only for a moment, but it was enough. Anne stood behind her, her face pale and lifeless, her eyes fixed on Sarah with a gaze so intense, it felt as if it could burn a hole through her. That night, Sarah made her decision. She couldn't stay. She couldn't let Anne claim her the way she had claimed Martha. So, under the cover of darkness, Sarah fled. She gathered only what she could carry, her coat, a lantern, and a few personal items, and slipped out of the estate without a word. The air outside was thick with fog, the moon hidden behind a blanket of clouds, casting the night in eerie shadows. But Sarah didn't care. She needed to put as much distance between herself and the house as possible. She ran into the woods, the branches tearing at her dress, the undergrowth pulling at her feet. The further she went, the more disoriented she became. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted limbs like skeletal hands reaching for her, their bark whispering her name. And then she heard it, the baby's cry. It echoed through the forest, rising and falling with the wind, growing louder with every step she took. Sarah's heart raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she stumbled through the undergrowth, desperate to escape the sound. But no matter how fast she ran, the cries followed her, haunting her every step. And then she saw her Anne. The ghost stood at the edge of the clearing, bathed in the pale light of the lantern, her face a mask of grief and anger. She was holding the baby, its tiny body limp in her arms, its cries filling the air with an otherworldly sorrow. Sarah Ann's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the night like a blade. You can't run. Sarah's legs buckled beneath her, and she fell to the ground, her hands clawing at the dirt as she tried to push herself up. But it was no use. Anne was already moving toward her, her pale figure gliding through the trees like a shadow. No, please. Sarah's voice was a strangled sob as she tried to crawl away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Anne knelt beside her, her cold, dead eyes locking onto Sarah's. You took him from me. You took everything from me. With a final, desperate scream, Sarah disappeared into the fog, her voice swallowed by the night, leaving nothing behind but the echo of Anne's chilling whispers. The price of cruelty. By the time the servants discovered that Sarah had fled, it was too late. She was gone, swallowed by the woods, never to be seen again. Some whispered that she had been taken by the spirits, that Anne had claimed her in the same way she had haunted Martha. Others believed that Sarah had simply lost her way in the forest, driven mad by guilt and fear. But whatever the truth, one thing was certain: Sarah would not be returning. Martha, meanwhile, was beyond saving. The once proud and haughty woman had become little more than a shell, her mind shattered by the relentless hauntings. She no longer spoke, no longer acknowledged the world around her. She spent her days huddled in the corner of her room, her eyes wide and unblinking, her lips moving soundlessly as she whispered to ghosts only she could see. Anne's spirit had broken her completely. The servants, terrified of the curse house, began to leave one by one. The Leland estate, once a symbol of wealth and power, was now little more than a haunted ruin, a place where the dead outnumbered the living. And so, the two wives paid the ultimate price for their cruelty. One lost her mind, the other lost her life, both of them cursed by the spirits they had wronged. In the end, there was no escape, no redemption, only death. The fate of the wives was sealed the moment they chose to betray Anne, and the house cursed and broken would forever bear witness to their downfall. Part 9. The Abandoned Estate. The Leland estate, once a towering symbol of wealth, power, and status, had withered into a decaying monument to unspeakable horrors. Time had not been kind to the mansion, nor had it forgotten the tragic events that unfolded within its cursed walls. The grounds that once flourished with meticulously maintained gardens were now overgrown with wild, thorny vines, creeping like the ghosts of the past. The statues that once stood proudly in the garden had cracked and crumbled, their stone faces eroded by the passing years, much like the family that once occupied the grand estate. Rumors spread quickly throughout the nearby village, growing more terrifying with each retelling. They said the estate was haunted by the vengeful spirits of Anne and her child, doomed to wander its halls for eternity, seeking revenge on those who had wronged them. No one dared speak of the Leland house out loud, for fear that even the mention of it would call forth the spirits that dwell within. A curse hung heavy over the place, like a cloud of despair that no amount of time could lift. Decay and silence. The house itself, once vibrant with life and the hustle of servants, now stood silent and decaying, like a forgotten relic of a past better left buried. The once imposing mansion was now a shadow of its former self, sagging under the weight of neglect and the terrible secrets it harbored. Its windows, broken and shattered, stared like empty eye sockets into the surrounding woods, while the front doors, heavy, iron-bound, and once a gateway to grandiose parties, now hung crookedly on their hinges, barely held together by rust. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, weaving through the shattered windows and broken beams, carrying with it the echoes of lost voices. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the stench of rot, but there was something else, something deeper. The silence inside the house wasn't merely the absence of sound, it was an oppressive force, almost tangible, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. As the years passed, no one dared come close to the Leland estate. The few brave souls who had ventured inside, be it out of curiosity or desperation, had not returned. The village children told stories of those who entered the house and were swallowed by the darkness, never to be seen again. Their parents, fearful of the estate's terrible history, would warn them to stay far away, reminding them of the curse that lay upon the house and the restless spirits who wandered its corridors. The haunting presence. The presence of Anne was unmistakable within the house. Even though she had been dead for many years, her spirit lingered, her grief and anger anchoring her to the place where she had died so tragically. And with her, the infant she had brought into the world, only for him to be cruelly snatched away. The air inside the estate always seemed unnaturally cold, even in the heat of summer. The house's walls seemed to hold the last cries of the child, muffled but ever present, echoing through the silent halls. And Anne's presence, strong, vengeful, was palpable in every room. Late at night, those who dared to pass by the estate swore they could hear the faint cries of a baby drifting on the wind. It was said that on certain nights, the flickering light of a candle could be seen in the upper windows, as though something was still moving through the decaying room, searching for what had been taken from them. The legend grows. As the years turned into decades, the story of the Leland estate became legend. The once proud family name was now a ghost story, whispered around campfires and in darkened taverns. Some said the spirits of Anne and her child were trapped there, bound to the house by the evil deeds of the past, doomed to relive their final moments for all eternity. Others believed the house itself was alive, that it had absorbed the pain and suffering of those who had died there and was now cursed, forever seeking to pull more victims into its embrace. No one who lived in the village dared approach the house anymore. They avoided the road that led to it, even during the day. Hunters and travelers who ventured too close would return with stories of strange, chilling occurrences. They spoke of shadows moving through the trees, the sound of footsteps in the distance, and a coldness that seemed to seep into their bones no matter how warm the day. A forbidden place. The estate, now a ruin, had become a forbidden place. The villagers claimed that anyone who entered its gates was doomed, cursed to be hunted by the spirits that roamed within. Those who disappeared in the vicinity of the house were said to have been claimed by Anne, dragged into the depths of the mansion to share in her eternal torment. The house had a hunger of its own, a darkness that grew stronger with each soul it consumed. Despite the warnings, despite the palpable sense of dread that surrounded the house, there were always those who couldn't resist the pull of the unknown. Adventurers, thrill seekers, and ghost hunters all were drawn to the mystery of the Leland estate, hoping to uncover the truth behind the stories. But none of them were ever heard from again. The historian's quest. One such individual, a young historian fascinated by the macabre, arrived in the village late one autumn. He had heard the tales of the Leland estate, and against the advice of the villagers, was determined to document the history of the house and the curse that had befallen it. Armed with little more than a notebook, a lantern, and his own insatiable curiosity, he set off toward the estate just as dusk began to settle over the land. The path to the mansion was overgrown, nearly impossible to see beneath the tangled mass of weeds and brambles. The iron gates, rusted and bent, groaned in protest as he pushed them open. Beyond them, The house loomed like a black silhouette against the fading light, its broken windows staring out at him like hollow eyes. As the historian approached the house, the air grew colder and the silence around him became suffocating. But he pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. The front doors creaked open as he pushed them, revealing the dark, musty interior of the mansion. The smell of decay hit him like a physical blow, but he swallowed his fear and stepped inside. A house frozen in time. Inside, the mansion was a time capsule of horror. The grand staircase that once led to the upper floors was broken and rotting, but the ornate banister still bore the carvings of the Leland family crest. Cobwebs clung to every surface, and the faint scent of mildew permeated the air. The historian's lantern cast eerie shadows on the walls, and as he moved deeper into the house, the temperature dropped even further. He felt it almost immediately, the oppressive presence that filled the house. It was as though the walls themselves were watching him, breathing with a life of their own. The sound of his footsteps echoed unnaturally in the silence, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the hallway, extinguishing his lantern. Panic surged through him as he fumbled to relight it, but in the darkness he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. His blood ran cold. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, more desperate, as though it was coming from just down the hall. With trembling hands, the historian managed to light his lantern once more, but the flickering flame did little to comfort him. He knew the stories, knew what the cries meant, but he couldn't turn back now, not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. The final revelation. The historian followed the sound of the baby's cries, moving deeper into the house, down the long, twisting corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls seemed to close in around him, the air thickening with every step he took. The cries grew louder, more insistent, and soon they were joined by something else, a woman's voice, soft but filled with anger and sorrow. Give him back, the voice echoed through the house, and the historian's heart raced. He reached the door at the end of the corridor, and with shaking hands he pushed it open. Inside, the room was cold, so cold that his breath misted in the air, and there, standing in the center of the room, was Anne. Her ghostly form was pale and translucent, her long, dark hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. She wore the same blood-stained gown she had died in, and in her arms she cradled the baby, his tiny, lifeless form limp in her embrace. The historian froze, unable to move, his eyes locked on the tragic figure before him. Anne's eyes, dark, hollow, and filled with an unearthly rage, met his, and in that moment he understood the truth. This house would never let go of its past. It was bound to the spirits who had died here, their suffering woven into the very fabric of the walls. There was no escaping the curse of the Leland estate, and no one who entered would ever leave. As Anne's ghost began to move toward him, the historian realized too late that he had made a terrible mistake. The Leland estate was not just a place of death, it was a prison, and now he was trapped within it forever.